I was asked to speak on specific impacts for farming, agriculture, which is obviously an important issue in this region, more so because of the specialty nature of agriculture up in this part of Michigan, and then to touch briefly on water impacts. And I'll just preface this by saying, of all the things that we deal with in this climate change scenario stuff, getting a firm handle on actionable intelligence for planning for water is the worst one. So the high variability kind of precludes us of coming out with really staunch suggestions, but we'll do the best we can for you. So you know the old adage is first you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. Well, the first few slides will tell you what you heard this morning, and that is the temperatures are rising. For those of you who either are or have to deal with climate change deniers, these are not model data. These are actual observational data, right? So this is what you have been living through, whether you kept track of it or not. And fortunately, the National Weather Service keeps track of it. So the scatter of points shows how much variability there is, and that's why we as citizens usually can't get a handle on this stuff. How come our memory isn't as, clear in terms of trend analysis? Well, because the data are highly variable, and you need a little bit of statistical smoothing to see a trend in that scatter of points. And our state climatologist, Jeff Andreessen, that works in my department, tends to use a 9-year moving average to quiet the scatter in the points. So you can see, I drew the arrow there at the end, so from 1980, you can see that trend is positive and upward, and we see no reason why it would change from the physics of all of our climate change models. But these are observational data. The same thing with the frost-free season that you've heard about. We're getting a longer frost-free season, depending on where you are, closer to the lake, further inland, something on the order of 7 to 9 days on average. And precipitation is going up. This has big impact for urban stormwater management. Most of the older stormwater systems are woefully inadequate to handle the storm flows that we have to deal with now, both because overall precip is up, but more, as you'll see in a minute, the hyperstorms, the big frog strangling rain events, are up in frequency and up in intensity, and our underground infrastructure, our piping system and pumping system just is not adequate. I grew up in Detroit. How come the Lodge Freeway floods every time we get, one little spit of rain? Well, it was because it was designed for a climate that we no longer live in. So whether you believe in climate change or not, it has happened, and all you have to do is, be at Connor Avenue on the Lodge Freeway during a heavy rain event. You'll be standing in water and the traffic isn't moving. Here are some of the data that you've seen before. This is the regionalized stuff to look at the total annual precipitation changes from 91 through 2012 compared to the 1901 through 60. And you can see in Michigan, more so in the central part of the lower peninsula, those are the bigger changes in terms of increasing precip. But even here in northern and northwest Michigan, you can see a 5 to 10% increase, and some localized areas up to 15%. The state climatologist's office likes to look at these wet and wet following wet day frequencies, because that's when the first wetting event then fills up the pores in the receiving soils, right? And so there are two kinds of runoff. Obviously, if you have an impervious surface, you're going to get runoff no matter what happens, right? Because it's impervious. But if you have a soil circumstance, even if it's vegetated, you can have runoff because it rains too hard, and you know this when you're watering your petunias. If you turn on a fire hose, it doesn't matter how sandy the soil is, you can cause runoff if you throw enough water at it per unit time. All right, so that's one kind of runoff. The other one is, it's been a long enough rain event with enough water that you filled up all the pore spaces, and now we're relying on the infiltration capacity, and it's not there anymore. So storage capacity is gone. So these wet days following wet days are also on the increase. The trend is not quite as significant, but you're seeing both an increase in the number of wet days. This is for the Grand Rapids station, as well as the lower green graph, the number of wet days following a wet day. Different data sets talking about the same thing you heard about this morning from both of our speakers. The increase in the frequency and intensity of big rain events. They were both referring to the 1¼ inch, which is more of the stormwater management metric. These are what I call the classic frog strangling rain events, the 3-inch per day plus storm events. And as you can see by the histogram, we're up by 52% compared to the last decade in terms of these big rain events. The total amount of precipitation in our annual precipitation budget, if you will, is up by 39% coming from those extreme storms. So it's not just once in a blue moon. We're having many blue moons now as we, and this is again not predicted data but observational data. You've seen this map before. I wasn't so smart just to make mine change with the animated GIF, but maybe standing still is better for you. It's always been snowy in the UP and this part of the state, in the northern and northwest lower part of the state. But notice the red in particular has expanded inward away from the coast. And slightly to the south as well. And the UP, of course, now has been almost totally transformed. So we are getting more snow on an annual basis. And the reason for that is lake effect. Now that term had been used before. I just wanted to show you pictorially what we're talking about, because this is the positive feedback loop of not having ice on the Great Lakes. So you get two kinds of things going on here. First, you get the perturbation of the warmer. Now, you all know Lake Michigan is not warm any time of the year, and it's certainly not warm in the wintertime. But compared to a polar vortex, it's really warm. And so that causes a perturbation in the atmosphere to set up a storminess pattern that wouldn't be there if the lake wasn't there. And, as was mentioned by Kim this morning, it also is the ability to put water vapor into that storminess system. So you get the double whammy there. And you can look on the MODIS website from NOAA, and throughout our winters in the last decade in particular, these snow trains, or snow roads as they're called, linear cloud patterns show up dramatically. And as you can see here in Lake Michigan, nothing's going on over on the coast on the Wisconsin side, because that's on the upwind side, right? So the wind has to get a hold of the warmer, relatively speaking, warmer water and the water vapor to set up for a snow load. And in northwest Michigan, that's where it's all being dumped. The main take-home message, I have a friend that used to run retreats, religious retreats, and he was always worried about this time of the talk, the post-meal talk, people kind of dozing off, and so he spoke quite loudly, but whenever he wanted to drive home a point, he would always more or less scream at the top of his lungs, "Remember this for life." And it was the sort of one crystallized take-home message that he wanted to get across. So if you remember nothing else from today's activities vis-a-vis climate change, remember this, that no matter what else you've learned, climate variability is on the rise. And we know from the records of human history that the slow, inexorable change are easier for societies to grip with because we have longer planning horizons to do something about it. But planning for increased variability is the worst of all possible circumstances. If you can go from really low to really high in a really short period of time, what the hell do you plan for? Certainly not the middle of the road, then you're screwed no matter what, right? Except for one time, right? But do you always plan for the low? Do you always plan for the high? And then you have to, for those of you that are in public policy making, you got to support a budget. And then somebody says, well, what's the probability that's going to happen? Well, now I'm setting my budget on the 90th percentile, the 10th percentile. So this is very difficult for humans to deal with an increasing variability. But our recent observed data show that variability is happening. The atmosphere, if you will, is becoming more volatile. And that is the worst case for us to deal with, no matter what sector you represent. But farming is inherently a risk management operation, and so farming in general is more at risk because we're having to manage farming in the context of a more variable climate going forward. And just to drive that point home, look at some recent statistics for Michigan. We had the big heat wave in March of 2012, followed by the big drought, when if you had irrigation, you were irrigating. That was the year I mapped irrigation from aerial photography, because I knew if things were green, you irrigated it, because if it wasn't irrigated, it wasn't green. The next year was the wettest year on record. So what's up with that? We go from a drought to the wettest year on record in Michigan in 1 year time frame. In the 2013-14 winter, that was the coldest winter in the last 100 years. And of course you heard in the background of those who are climate deniers saying, well, it's all climate warming, surely it isn't happening because it's the coldest year on record. I have to say that as a scientist, that was, we screwed up big time early on, not recognizing that all of our science gets translated into 15-second sound bites, and we allowed the public to know what we were doing under the rubric of climate warming or global warming. It's not global warming. In some places it's cooling, and in some places it's warming. In some places it's wetter, in some places it's drier. If we had a 15-second soundbite, it should have been global climate variability is on the rise. That would have been a far better thing. But now we're screwed because we've got a whole generation who only knows this whole topic by the two words global warming. And so every time it gets cold, clearly there can't be global warming. I better get off my soapbox before I So in 2014-15, that was one of the top 10 coldest winters. So now we had back-to-back really cold stuff. But guess what? In December of 2015, that was the warmest December on record. And we've been keeping records since the 1800s. So again, notice that there's no one thing you can point to, and that's the point. Variability is going up, making the management opportunities somewhat limited, or certainly more difficult. So let's look here in northern Michigan at some of the impacts that this stuff has been bringing us. Typically the yields for traditional field crops, corn, soybean, wheat, that sort of thing, in this region have always been constrained by length of the growing season on the one hand, and the timing and amount of precipitation during the growing season on the other. How many of you know our area as sort of the water wonderland, right? I mean, we're surrounded by water. We love our lakes and streams. We think there's so much water, how could we possibly run out? How many of you recognize that Michigan is the driest state east of the Mississippi during the growing season? Almost no one. And I get that all the time. And so, as I think Anthony's slide showed in the model stuff in particular, but it's also bearing out in the recorded observational data, our climate is shifting to a bimodal precipitation distribution with increased precipitation in the late winter and spring, a secondary hump in the fall, and nothing in the middle when we want to grow stuff. So keep that in mind. In contrast, up here, as you know, we have a lot of specialty agriculture, and the big money driver, of course, is the tree fruit industry, also the viticulture. So those have special requirements, and the primary weather-related constraint for the tree fruit industry is the frequency and severity of frosts and freezes during spring. And there's been some mention of that. I want to highlight that in particular as an economic impact coming from our climate. So on a positive note, we've already shown you 3 times now, or 4 times, that we do have a longer growing season. And depending on where you are on the conservative side, we could say it's by 7 to 10 days already have occurred. And I think Anthony was showing it was going to get way more than that by weeks in the mid-century and beyond. Now, unfortunately, coming along with that, the frequency of spring freeze events following initial stages of phenological development have also increased. Now, Anthony's stuff was looking at budding date, which he mentioned is not the only measure because we come out of hardening pre-bud. So the tree crops are sensitive before blossom and budding by a few weeks. So it is true that, and it was difficult to model because of the complexity at the local scale, so I don't fault that project whatsoever, but it is true now that we have these increased risks coming up because we have the earlier spring warming events, which tend to come so early that there's still opportunities, and this year was a good example of that, of a following freeze event. And by the way, the freeze events that are the worst ones for us in the fruit industry is not another polar vortex onslaught from Canada sharing their resources with us, but rather clear skies, persistent high pressure, and radiation freeze events. So we don't have to have super, super cold air masses coming in to do the damage. All we have to have is persistent high pressure systems, which we're getting, allowing essentially the whole ecosystem to look at the cold of deep space, and we have this flux of temperature network loss, and that's what's causing the problem. So just several recent events that you all might have actually participated in up here make this point. In March of 2012, we had that unprecedented heat wave over Michigan that brought all of the fruit crops out of dormancy more than a month ahead of schedule, so to speak, or ahead of normal. And then in the following April and May, a series of freeze events that resulted in severe cold damage to all of our crops. Tart cherries yield that year were down 90% compared to the year before, apples down 88% from this region, and sweet cherries down 80%. This was the year when Cherry Republic had to go to Poland to buy cherries to keep that business alive. This is going to be happening more and more and more. So on the research side of the house, and what some of our colleagues over at the Hort Station that Anthony mentioned are doing, are looking for other genotypes that might be more resistant to this kind of a pattern, or we're having to shift out of that industry altogether. There is a technological fix, and so there are people working on the engineering side of the house, so how could you mitigate these freeze events? You've all seen smudge pots out in orchards, you know, especially the citrus groves in Florida, you see them all the time. And many tourists driving down the road, they see all this smoke, and they think that the farmers are trying to warm the crop by the fires, and they're just seeing the smoke from the fires. That's not the point at all. The point is to create a cloud. We're trying to cut off that radiative flux of a clear sky. If we can do that, and if we can pull a big thermal blanket over these things, and I'm sure there's going to be an entrepreneur that will come up with this. Right now it's not practical, but if we can physically pull a big blanket over the orchard, that's all it needs. We don't have to actually insulate it, we just have to cut off that radiative freeze pathway. Let's talk about CO2 enhancement. That was mentioned briefly this morning. For those that only look at the big ahas, or the big bullet points, and then they come up with the sort of one-size-fits-all solution. Of course, CO2 enrichment has been demonstrated by biologists to be good for plants. So it does have some positive benefits, without question. It reduces ET. The plants have to kind of throttle back because they can overheat by raising their metabolism, let me put it that way. It increases photosynthesis. It increases above ground biomass, that's what the AG subscript is, above ground biomass, and in most cases will increase yields. Those are all positive benefits of growing plants in a chamber that has increased CO2. Oh, by the way, now that we're in the new month, we can report, we just finished April, right? Anybody keep track of the Keeling curve from the Mauna Loa? I know you're all watching the eruptions in Hawaii right now, but the Mauna Loa Observatory is one of our key stations recording at the longest period of record from the mid-50s, recording CO2 in the atmosphere. April of this year was the highest monthly average of CO2 concentration in our atmosphere, 410.8 parts per million. And we can talk about the long-term geologic record when it's been 10 times more than that, but when it was 10 times more than that, there wasn't any oxygen either, so pick your poison. The point is that there's no trend in the Keeling curve that shows any indication of a downward motion whatsoever. So when Anthony was taking you through those various scenarios, the super aggressive and the business as usual, I'm afraid, you know, we are dullards when it comes to public policy worldwide, and we're not going to be able to stop this engine. So if you're trying to do risk management, you're probably well advised to at least take the middle of the road model, if not the business as usual, just pump it out there, because there does not seem to be any change in the flux of CO2. It just keeps going up and up and up. Now, the interesting part from our crop production is that increasing temperatures, which we've demonstrated have already happened and will continue to happen, when coupled with increased CO2, has positive and negative benefits, not just positive benefits. So over the Christmas holidays, we had a little research seminar on campus, and I learned of some soybean research down at the University of Illinois that showed that for soybeans, which is an important crop here in the upper Midwest, in cooler growing seasons, the yields increased by 10% under increased CO2. This FACE thing is free atmosphere carbon enrichment. It's really a cool engineering solution to a problem. We used to do biologic estimates of what happens with increasing CO2 in the atmosphere by putting plants in a growth chamber. But by putting them in a growth chamber, you pretty much mitigate or get rid of or hold constant all the other variables that are not constant in the real world of growing a crop out in the open field, right? So I don't know who it was, but some guy said, hey, I can fix that. We can grow our crops out in the field and get carbon dioxide enrichment. Well, how the heck do you do that? Well, they just built this octagonal piping system that envelops a pretty big area in the field. They have a weather station in the middle of it that has a every 4-second CO2 monitor on it, and they pump CO2 into this pipe, and there are orifices along the 8 sides of the octagon. And the little wind meter in the middle of it says which way is the wind blowing every 4 seconds. And so every 4 seconds the computer says, hey, squirt some more CO2 from this side. Whoop, squirt some more from this side. And in doing that, they can enrich the CO2 inside that growth chamber, but have the same soil, the same precipitation, the same sunlight, the same insects, all that, as the rest of the field. Pretty cool experiment. And they do it for corn and other crops. But what they found is that in warmer growing seasons, the yields actually went down. So we're telling you that CO2 is going up, has gone up, and will likely continue to go up. Temperatures have gone up and will likely to continue to go up. If you're a corn grower, you need to be concerned about that and hope that some plant breeders are coming up with better genotypes, especially if you're in southern Michigan. I think people that have fertile, low slope ground here in northern Michigan will be able to make some money on this, because essentially the corn belt is going to shift to the north, but you'd probably be better off doing soybeans than corn to be more resilient. Overall, plants are simply more sensitive to drought stress under elevated CO2. So if you think about it, it's like, do you want to maintain the mechanics of a 57 Chevy, or do you want to maintain the mechanics of a Lamborghini, you know? Yes, it's a fine watch, but it takes a lot of tinkering. So that's kind of what's happening with the CO2 enrichment. We put the plant community at sort of the high throttle end of things, and the wheels fall off more easily, which means that drought stress is felt more readily under enhanced CO2 concentrations. So here's the only slide I have, I think, that shows projections of these various global climate models. They're at coarse resolution, actually fine resolution if you're a climate modeler, coarse resolution for the rest of us who deal with, you know, finer scale data at the 250 meter level and below. But notice the dichotomy no matter which map you choose between northern Michigan and southern Michigan. So you're looking here at what happens to yields for rain-fed corn. That is, you're not relying on artificial irrigation. And you can see that the main agricultural part of southern Michigan is in trouble no matter which scenario we choose, which model we choose, by having, let's say on average, something of 5 to 25% yield decline. Now, the technological solution may be coming out of the lab with different genotypes that might be more drought tolerant and that sort of thing. And that loops us into yet another political quagmire of genetically modified crops. But we can't wait around for Linnaeus to crossbreed corn plants until he is 58 years old, right? You got to get this stuff in the marketplace pretty soon to show that it's going to work. So there's going to be more stress in agriculture in southern Michigan, far less in northern Michigan. But I think you'll see an increased trend from a planning zoning perspective with the potential expansion of cropland into areas that didn't used to be cropland, or changes in what was growing, shifts from hay or wheat into cultivated row crops of corn and soybean. Here's the soybean picture. Notice that southern Michigan fares far better. So if you're a hedger in the commodities market, you're going to be banking more on soybean than on corn. But if you already are operative in southwest Michigan, which is the seed corn capital of the world, this is a troubling map. This is why this solution is not, mitigating climate. That train has left the station long ago, unfortunately. It's adaptive planning. And for the seed corn people, we're going to have to rely on new plant stuff, or they're going to go out of business. And if you think of the multi-$100-million industry that represents and the ripple effect for rural communities in southwest Michigan, if that goes down, that's a huge issue that they need to be jumping on right now in terms of their community sustainability. Forget Joe Farmer X. They're going to have to do what they're going to have to do for risk management. But what if all the seed corn industry pulls out of southwest Michigan? What does that do to the communities, to the educational system, to the roads, to everything, right? That's a big, big issue. Northern Michigan looks pretty good. That's the white is actually the pale yellow, which means that we're within the noise level, plus or minus 5% of baseline. So with the longer growing season, that was really the main mitigator up here, that we didn't have a long enough growing season to sustain really cash cropping, and now it looks with the warming growing season that we might. Here's the big problem with the temperature and CO2. This is the yield fall off for corn on the left and soybeans on the right. Soybeans are a little more adaptive to warmer weather, but not by a huge amount. So the break point is 84.2 Fahrenheit for corn before you start seeing the yield declines, and it's 86 Fahrenheit for the soybeans. And it really turns out to be nighttime temperatures. That's the key indicator that farmers need to be looking at for whether their crops are at risk or not. And then some indirect changes that these climate things will bring along. The increased incidence with pests and pathogens are likely, just that old thing you learned in high school biology that, with the increase in temperature, the rate of things increases, and we suspect that why are pests pests? Because they're so damned adaptive, right? Well, they're keeping up with climate change and the rest of us aren't. So we already have some pretty compelling both insect pest information and weed pest information to indicate that weeds are doing just fine, thank you. And under high CO2, they don't seem to have this temperature decline. They keep on going. That's going to be a problem for us if our weed control doesn't work as well as it used to. And we're showing that with some decreased efficacy of herbicides under this enhanced CO2 regime that we're in. Increased rates of soil erosion due to these frog strangling rain events, clear. Now, how long have we been barking about conservation tillage and no-till? All of my career, anyway. And we still have farmers that haven't even thought about doing it. Well, if you needed one more reason to do it, it's the climate that you're operating in right now. Forget climate change and all of its political back and forth. The climate you're operating in right now is more volatile than your dad's or your granddad's, and it's not coming back. It's not going to quiet down. It's only going to get worse. And one of those is going to be increased runoff. That means we better keep some kind of a cover on the soil, particularly up here in northern Michigan, where the topography is such that we're farming a little bit higher sloped lands than we tend to do in southern Michigan. So no-till and conservation tillage will become more important than ever from a water quality perspective. And if you think about it, soil that washes off of your ground and into the river, you don't get back again, and you only have so much topsoil. So it's to your best benefit if you're a farmer to keep it where you can grow it. The projected impacts on streams and groundwater. Anthony talked a little bit about this. This is, I said, one of the worst things to deal with. We have so little data long term that we don't have a lot of things to calibrate to and fit our models to. But we do have, there's no new physics and chemistry here. That's the great thing about uniformitarianism, you know. We can look at a system and say, all right, let's talk about what we think might happen. So we already have shown by record that more winter rain has occurred and is likely to continue to occur. Well, that should give us earlier peak stream flows. So the date of the peak stream flow should be coming earlier in the year. We have more runoff in the autumn and winter because that's where the precipitation is shifting to. And we get the double whammy in the spring of snowmelt and liquid precipitation. And we have other changes in stream flows, but basically increasing winter and spring stream flows. That's one issue, but from a habitat standpoint in the stream and a water utilization, summer low flows will continue to go down. And Anthony's data showed summer low flows are going to continue and get worse. That's the most stressful time for our stream systems. Our entire water use legislative regulatory environment is based off of index flow, which is the median low flow in August, well, usually August, and that's only going to go down. And because the statute didn't set up rulemaking, which would make us more adaptive, we could get a learning group together and figure that out in a month and then make suggested changes. Now we have to go find somebody to propose legislation and go through the slings and arrows of getting that passed. So from a water resources perspective, we know what needs to be done, which is to bring our water use regulatory environment into this century and taking into account these climate change differences, but we don't have that in place yet. Anthony also talked about increasing ET, and I want you to recall back, he showed a budget map, and ET was the top, I think it was blue, darker tone, and it was the majority of the budget. We tend to forget about that as humans because we don't think about that so much. It's kind of not seeable, but that's the biggest part of the checkbook. And that's changing the most. So that increased ET very well may outstrip the increases in precipitation, and as a result, you're going to see increased drought risk and an increasing demand, therefore, for irrigation. Certainly, we're seeing increases in irrigation demand in southern lower Michigan. I think you're going to be seeing it up here. You are already in the potato country, but and that's for a different reason. They need it for their way they manage it. But you're also going to see it for cropping systems. Well, that brings us back to, do we have the adequate data to know about the index flows in our streams? Are they changing? Have they changed since the data was first analyzed? And is the system picking up on these changes? And I think the answer to all those questions is no, and so we better get busy about it. So here's the big thing. In our classification scheme for water management for water withdrawals, we have 3 stream sizes and 4 temperature classes. This is showing both of them together, but just look at the colors, not the widths, because I want to focus on temperature. And I want to in particular look at the cold transitional streams, which are the ones in the blue colors. And they're sort of the notable tourist streams in northern Michigan, right? The lower Osable, the north branch, the south branch, the Manistee, those are all cold transitional streams, which means they're already at the ecological edge of their fish habitat sustainability. So small changes in the environment, like base flow coming in, or decreasing amount of index flow in the stressful period, will push them to the next category down and potentially permanently change the fish. So what would the industry that is based around trout fishing do in 10 years' time if there aren't any trout in certain streams? So it's more than just, well, okay, you guys got to go someplace else to fish. Well, all right. But what happens to all of the ripple effect of people coming and renting rooms in your motels and going to your restaurants and getting their cars fixed and buying the gas and the groceries? You know, that whole ripple effect in economy or communities that are based around these streams is at peril in some of these cases. I also want to make a pitch, and Anthony mentioned this as well, the land use stuff. We do have control over how we use land, and I'm making the pitch because Engler is my president now, and I remember what he proposed when he was the governor of selling off state forest land as a way to make money. Do not let anybody do that. And if anything, we want more forests up here. One of the beauties and one of the reasons you have the ecosystems you have in northern Michigan is that it is so heavily forested. So if you're on a planning commission and there's public forest land that somebody is saying we should sell that and make some money on that because we can put homes in there or whatever it might be, we'll get the double whammy, we'll get an influx from the sale, plus you'll get the downstream taxes, that'll all be great. Yeah, but what has it done to the hydrologic cycle? And the main point is that we know from long-term experiments all around the world that groundwater recharge is heightened, maximized under forest land cover. It's obviously minimized under impervious surfaces of the downtown CBD. So that's the continuum we deal with. So we want to protect our forests. We are fortunate in northern lower Michigan to have so many acres of publicly owned forest between the state forest land, the federal forest land, and a few county forest lands as well. So be protective of your forests. They will help you in many, many ways with regard to water resources. And that's all I have to say about that.
All right.